Hello, everyone. Welcome in. My name is Alyssa Bombardier-Shaw, our outreach manager here at Represent Women, and I am so honored to welcome you back to the final day of the 2024 Democracy Solutions Summit. We are so fortunate to have the chance to bring together experts and leaders from all around the world who are working on solutions to build a 21st century democracy. Thank you all so much for being here today. As you likely know, tomorrow is International Women's Day, so we wanted to focus the last day of the Democracy Solution Summit on women's leadership around the world. Leaders across the globe are challenging the status quo and demanding a new way of governing that doesn't involve binary choices or zero-sum thinking or aggressive competition. We will hear from international women politicians, advocates, and thought leaders who are doing the work in making a difference in their countries. Today, our experts will be highlighting both electoral and non-electoral strategies that have proven to level the playing field for women to run and serve. We will also hear from women leaders about real-life initiatives that are shifting the paradigms of power and crafting new and improved ways of governing. At Represent Women, our international research is a cornerstone of our organization, so we are thrilled to get to learn from our global neighbors and imagine how we might adapt these strategies for the US context. A few housekeeping notes. This event will be recorded and posted on our website after the event, and closed captions are available in your Zoom menu. Also, the chat is open, so please feel free to use that space to connect with each other and engage in an intentional way. To kick us off today, we have Namatai Kukweza, founder and director of We Lead and winner of the Kofi Annan Next Gen Democracy Prize. Namatai, you have the floor. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi there, can you hear me? Please just confirm and then we are good to go.
We hear you great. Thanks so
Fantastic.
much.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really a great honor to be here, and I'm very excited to be given this opportunity to be giving the keynote address for this particular engagement. I would like to just ensure that I pour my experiences, my gathered knowledge, but also my passion and my heart out in terms of issues to do with women, and particularly young women, and their participation in leadership, decision-making, governance, and also their representation in public office. So to just kickstart this whole conversation, I will just mention that I work for a youth leadership development and advocacy organization called We Lead Trust here in Zimbabwe. And over the last couple of years, we have been doing a lot of work around getting more young people into public office leadership. And part of this work has meant that we are working with a lot of young women. And also, we have been in a position where we have documented a lot of their experiences, which has made me increasingly passionate about the issues to do with leadership for young women, grooming young women for leadership, but also putting in place reforms that also enable them to show up for leadership. So we have done a research last year. It's called Feminizing Solidarity Networks. And it basically talks about feminist solidarity practices that are meant to enhance the participation of young women in leadership. Because the critical inquisition was to say, why is it that the young women keep falling away? Why is it that the young women keep dropping out at some point? And as women grow older, like a pyramid, there are less women as you get to the top. So that those were the critical questions, and I think I will explore some of that here today, before also sharing a couple of stories and then wrapping it up. So thank you so much for having me. And as you can see, I am in the dark. We don't have electricity, but I made sure that my devices had some power so that I could participate. And I think that is where I will start my conversation, the issues around inequalities, and also looking at this conversation from an intersectional lens. The fact that we are women does not mean that we are the same. We are very different. We exist in different contexts. And there are a lot of intersectional issues that come into play that affect how we show up, how we participate. And I think that when we look at things from an intersectional and also feminist perspective, we quickly get into the realization that A lot of the unique experiences that women do experience will be affected by a lot of these intersectional brackets that we find ourselves in. This could be fundamentally based on race. They could be, based on age. It could be ethnicity. It could be the fact that one has an immigrant status. All of these are elements that actually affect what kind of access, what kind of power, what kind of privilege we have at different points. And the conversation around privilege, around access, around power is a very critical conversation to have when we talk about issues to do with women's participation and women's representation in leadership, and particularly political leadership. A lot of things are interacting with a lot of women from the place of who they are, where they're from, and who they are and where they're from. And a just and equal system must not in any way limit them or inhibit them from reaching the heights of their potential as leaders. But in the current world that we live in, that has so many inequalities, the fact that some women do have better access to resources, to energy, to the internet. Some women have better access to education, to water. They don't have to walk, long distances to be able to get water. The fact that some women are in drought-stricken places or in war zones. The fact that some women find themselves in communities that are economically disadvantaged does affect how women show up, and fundamentally, it also affects the number of women that do end up in leadership and who are represented in public office and in public life. The facts of the matter being that the environments that we come from affect men and women differently. And that is something that can always be stated from an intersectional outlook. If you look at women, like I gave an example, in a community that struggles to have water in an African sense, it is usually the duty of the women to make sure that the homestead, the household, has water. And this brings into the conversation issues around gender roles that women will often have to do extra within the household setting, which probably man would not be expected to do. And all of these things are piling up and creating a system that fundamentally obligates women to participate in a lot of unpaid care work and have a lot of gender roles in the household. And fundamentally, this affects how they, will show up. And those are critical conversations at a very micro level, at a very individual level, that are going to affect women in terms of how they show up. So when I have those conversations, before we get into the bigger political conversations about how the men take all the resources and how they're skimming, and there's little corners of the world where they are in bars at 12 at night, or there's places that women have limited access to, how they pass on opportunities to each other. There are a lot of critical conversations that we must have at a very basic level that actually affect the woman, that actually affect how women will show up. And those conversations are actually happening in the politics of the household. And I think in different societies and in different cultures, depending with how patriarchy is structured, some of these societal norms and standards, some of these social orientations and socializations are going to actually affect women in a manner that could either propel them forward or actually draw them back. And I think this is where the conversation must start, at this very honest, authentic, real level where we are discussing, women's lives from when they are very private and individual and intimate, as they also venture out into becoming very public, and becoming representatives in public office leadership and making their choices, not being limited by their circumstances, by their socialization, or by, the patriarchal norms and standards that society keeps pressing on them, but they are making these decisions to actually venture out and lead and show up, and also have, the community support, the family support, to be able to show up and to actually make a difference as leaders in public office leadership. So having given that backdrop, I now just want to, talk a little bit about some of the key issues that we find in terms of us wanting to shift power and build power around women's participation in leadership. And fundamentally, we will look at this from a social perspective. We will look at this from an economic perspective. We will also look at this from a political perspective. And we must be cognizant that all of these factors are actually mutually inclusive. And this is to say that these factors are not independent of each other. We must also have a critical conversation around patriarchy. And basically, this is a system of society and or government in which men hold power and women are largely excluded from it. And also have critical conversations around feminism. And basically, this is when we talk about a political movement of ideologies that puts an emphasis of equality, social, economic, and political equality of the sexes. And I think these are very important things to have at the back of our minds when we are having this discussion. Um, because we then look at, some of the social and socioeconomic barriers that women are going to be interacting with and facing as they want to venture out into leadership. And I'm just going to go through that stuff. So you have issues around poverty, you have issues around, the informalized economy. And this might not be something that is common in places like the USA, but in places like Africa, there's a very common issues. And the informal economy, the informal sector is very hostile, it's very fluid. And it takes a very a violent form towards women because there is minimum accountability, and it makes it harder for women to actually make a lot in the way of resources. We also look at it from a place of religion and its impact in terms of women's participation and how they show up. And I think that in different parts of the world, if you look at religion in Africa, if you look at religion maybe in the Middle East, we are going to see issues to do with how that actually affects how women show up. There are certain ways of being, certain standards where women are restricted from presenting themselves in a certain way, from appearing to be superior to men. And all of these can actually limit how women will show up for public office leadership. There are also a lot of elements around culture. In certain cultures, it is a taboo that women speak to men unless they have been spoken to. It is a taboo that women stand in front of a lot of people, especially men, because the idea is that a woman is supposed to be discreet and she is not supposed to be putting herself out there because that can invite, sexualized attention and that is indecent, right? So a lot of cultures will have all of these perceptions, and I'm going to tie this neatly at the end in terms of how that affects women and how they show up. We also have a lot of issues around the weaponization of sex and sexuality, that when a woman is leading and she's doing well, if people want to bring her down, the first thing that they're going to point at is her sex and sexuality, her sex life. They're going to want to put out nudes, and they're going to want to, maybe have a sexualized violence in the form of pornography, revenge pornography. These are actually common things, not only in the global north, but in the global south. And those are things that affect women in their participation in leadership. Other issues are to do with the desirability, which is also very culturally related, that there is a lot of grooming that if a woman is now too powerful, she is no longer desirable and she is no longer marriage material. And I say that in quotes. And a lot of women are told to refrain from wanting to be more powerful because apparently it's not a thing that will attract you a mate. And in as much as for a lot of places that are progressive, they might not see how this is a bearing in terms of how women decide. But in there's so many places, and especially with young women, it has a bearing because they want to be desirable. They don't want to be the social outcast, the one that's unmarried and undesirable and unwanted by men. So all of these are some of the things that will affect women's participation. There's also a lack of access to influential circles, societal circles, and some of these things are fundamentally because a lot of what we call networking spaces are not necessarily built for women, and they're not necessarily safe for women. A lot of the high society spaces are designed, for men. Some of them are happening in very odd hours. Some of them are happening in very dangerous places where women might not be comfortable to participate in. And unfortunately, these are the places in which power is being decided, in which resources are being allocated, and women have limited access to some of these spaces. And if they do have access to some of these spaces, they prove to be extremely dangerous for women. We also talk about issues to do with lack of information, and I think especially in certain parts of the world where we might not have as much internet connectivity, we might not have as much digital literacy, women actually fall behind and they have little access to information, and this also draws them back. There are also issues to do with education and health, those inequalities around how women might not have as much access as their male counterparts, accessing education, accessing health, and also issues to do with how the media projects women in leadership. So all of these things come together. And you take in social media in the mix, you take into issues of socialization, but fundamentally the over scrutiny that women will experience, and the fact that we have not built safety nets, we've not put in place certain mechanisms to protect women, and often individuals who are responsible for harassing women, for creating systems that militate against women or are extremely violent to women, go unpunished, go unpenalized, and the behavior goes on. There are also a lot of political barriers like violence. And I think violence in itself must be understood in its entirety. A lot of people talk about violence in a physical sense, right? Abductions, torture. I've seen videos of women who participate in politics and who organize and are participating to campaign for other women or for themselves. And some of those women are raped. Some of those women have been stripped naked and beaten up in public. I've seen viral videos that have cropped up in the internet in recent years where women were actually abused for organizing in terms of their political interest and their political participation. Okay, I can see Elisa has turned her video on, so I'll be rounding up. So I think violence in itself can be very much physical, but it can be emotional, psychological, mental, and I think we have to analyze it in its entirety. It can come in the form of leadership shaming, success shaming, in which women are shamed for being successful. So, in a nutshell, all of these are some of the major challenges that women are going to be facing. And I think that the critical conversations around how do we get past that? How do we build infrastructure? How do we build legislative infrastructure that would be enabling for women to be able to be represented and to participate is something that we must tilt this conversation towards. So I will round it up by saying that I live in Zimbabwe.
I'm not sure.
Looks like we might have lost Namatai. We might have her back. We'll make sure that we get her final words and we'll send those out to you to wrap up the whole conversation. But I just want to say thank you so much, Namatai, for setting the stage today. Your perspective is so crucial for these types of conversations. And we really appreciate you being here despite the power outages. We really appreciate your time. Now we will be moving right into our first session, which will be a panel discussion all about how women are crafting new and improved ways of governing. Moderating our first discussion of the day is Victoria Pelletier, who is Represent Women's National Partnerships Manager. She is currently serving her first term on the Portland City Council and is the second Black woman in her city's history to be elected to this seat. I'd also like to introduce Yordanos Eowel. She is an Ethiopian-American democracy entrepreneur and the founder and CEO of KESEB. KESEB is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization building an ecosystem for cross-country learning, collaboration, and innovation to advance inclusive and resilient democracies. Next up is Marjan Assasi, the executive director of the North American branch of the Federation for Innovation in Democracy. She is also a Future of Democracy Fellow at the Berggruen Institute and a Senior Innovations Fellow at the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability at Ohio State University. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Nadel. Jennifer is an author, activist, and award-winning journalist who serves as the co-director of the think tank Compassion in Politics. Jennifer works to help foster more empathetic politics across the political spectrum, working with over 100 members of parliament. Welcome to you all, and thanks so much for being here with us today. Before I pass things off, there will be time for an audience Q&A in this session, so I do encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in your Zoom dashboard. And you can also upvote questions that you would like particularly to be answered. With that, I will pass things over to you, Victoria.
Thanks, Alyssa. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Hello. Thank you for joining us. I'm personally really excited for this panel. I've been looking forward to it for a couple of weeks. I love chatting with incredible women doing big things, so I appreciate all of you for being here. And I think it's pretty clear that across the world, people are getting more activated and they're getting more involved in the political process. And I think everywhere the status quo is really being challenged. So I think in terms of shifting the paradigms of power, I'm just really excited for our audience to hear from each of you and hopefully feel a little bit more inspired as they learn about the amazing things that are happening across the world that each of you are doing. So I think the buzzword is hope today. It's hope, it's inspiration, it's change, it's Women's History Month. It's about to be International Women's Day. So I'm super excited. So let's get right into it. And Marjan, I want to start with you for my first question here. So this is kind of a two-part question. Your passion is advancing what's called deliberative democracy and specifically citizens' assemblies. So could you briefly explain what these are for our audience? And then I also know that you have launched a new program recently called the Federation for Innovation in Democracy North America. So it would be great as well if you could tell us a little bit about that program too. And I'll let you take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much, Victoria. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you to have this really important and timely conversation about bringing more women, more voices, but especially women, I think, to the table. And it's great to share the panel with Namatai, who just spoke and said such strong, powerful words, Victoria, Jordanos, and Jennifer as well. And it's especially fun to be here on the eve of International Women's Day. So I think that as Victoria mentioned, I'm the executive director of a very recently launched Federation for Innovation and Democracy North America, which builds on the great work of a European organization based in Belgium called the Federation for Innovation and Democracy Europe. And I thought that to answer your question, Victoria, in the few minutes that I have, I thought that I would take you on just a quick tour of kind of FIDE and my why, and then also our how. I think it's no big surprise to anybody who's on this call that most of us agree that we're facing a very challenging moment for representative democracies. And whether we call it democratic deficit or backsliding, the end of democracy, I've heard democracy on the verge of committing suicide, or the death of democracy altogether, I think one thing is quite clear, and that is that citizens are disillusioned and they feel disconnected from political institutions. So at FIDE, our why is driven by a desire to promote a thriving democratic culture that puts the public back into public policy. And at its core, we believe, and my own research, I believe that citizen-centric democracy is inclusive, it should be responsive, and it should reflect people's preferences. And this means promoting a culture and a democratic process, which I hope that we have time to talk about, because this is truly missing from the way that we do democracy these days, that basically does three different things. One of them for us is really important, and that is thinking and acting beyond the ballot box. In other words, being able to hold government accountable in between elections. That's one very big principle for us. The second one is introducing innovative, not traditional engagement platforms that bring marginalized voices, including more women, to the table. And finally, providing citizens with consistent and consequential voice in policy reform and government decision-making in between elections. So, how do we do that? How do we do that at FIDE? How have I done this over the past 4 or 5 years? We do this by designing democratic innovations that strengthen the citizen-state relationship. So while we talk about all these different deficits, one of the things that we find is really important is that we address is the weakening of the citizen-state relationship. And we focus, as Victoria mentioned, on principles of deliberative democracy and citizens' assembly. So What are citizens' assemblies for those in the audience who don't know what they are and are not familiar with them? Citizens' assemblies have been the most widely used democratic innovation around the world for the past decade and a half. The OECD has a database that traces between 600 and 800, depending on the definition that you use for a citizens' assembly. And typically, when we talk about a citizens' assembly, there are 5 main characteristics. And those 5 characteristics are, first and foremost, they should be initiated by government. A government body that mandates it, has a public problem, and wants citizens to be brought in to help it solve that problem. The second piece is we use sortition. So we use democratic lottery in order to bring together a broadly representative group of citizens. And we very often will oversample for marginalized voices to be able to ensure more inclusion. Thirdly, and this is one of the things that really drew me to this, at a time when polarization is so pervasive, 1/3 of the phases during a citizens' assembly is devoted to learning. So we bring experts, people get to read material, they talk to each other. And we have seen across all the citizens' assemblies that I've been involved with and many more that others have been working on, that there is a change in position. Sometimes it's nuanced, sometimes it's very serious, but people change their mind after they sit together and they don't start arguing, but they actually listen to experts. And of course, it's important to bring balanced experts, and all of that can be a whole hour-long conversation. And then the second phase is deliberation. So once citizens have learned together, then they deliberate, they debate, they think through the different issues. And finally, they write policy. So at the end of a citizens' assembly, and this is number 4, we produce a final deliverable. And that deliverable is either recommendations or proposals that finally, and the 5th element, is they go to government. And we hold government accountable with all sorts of different follow-up mechanisms so that we can ensure that policies, those proposals become policy. And so I know that we don't have a lot of time and we want to have a lot of conversation. So I will stop there, but I'm really happy in our discussion to either talk about FIDE in North America more specifically and the work that we're doing, my journey through deliberative democracy after 15 years in international development, or to talk about citizens' assemblies. And I'm happy to talk about specific examples or more sort of general questions that might come up. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Marjan. I know there's so much to talk about, such little time, but I really appreciate all of those details. And Yordanos, I want to go over to you because you are also doing incredible work. I think there's a term of cross-partisan work, and you're doing cross-country work to counter authoritarianism and make our democracies more inclusive and more resilient. So can you tell us a little bit about how you're doing that and the types of changes that you're seeing on the ground through your work?
Yes, well, thank you so much for hosting this incredible summit and for having me here, and kudos to the Represent Women team we know what it takes, myself and my team, we know what it takes to put on events like this, so a really deep appreciation for you all. I think before I get into the model, perhaps I'll share a little bit on my background, because I think that informs how the model came to be and some of the work that we're doing to date. So I'm originally from Ethiopia. I grew up there as a multi-ethnic individual and moved to the US when I was 13 as a daughter of a political asylee. And even when I didn't have language, I knew that I wanted certain things to support me and my family. One is a functioning government, and 2 is an inclusive society in which I could thrive, and my ethnic identity or racial identity wasn't politicized. And so with that, you know, I always had an interest in political science and eventually in governance broadly. And I spent the majority of my career in venture philanthropy, where I had the opportunity to work with really amazing visionary social entrepreneurs, helping them bring their transformative ideas to scale and make those institutions more sustainable and highly impactful. In doing that work, I think, as we all understand, that it became really apparent to me and many others that ecosystem was completely disconnected from the work that we're doing to strengthen democracy, whether in the US or other contexts, meaning that this innovation-centric movement that had truly revolutionized the nonprofit sector, that is not to say that the social entrepreneurship field doesn't have drawbacks, but it's certainly professionalized and brought this idea of evidence-based impact, and systemic solutions to address social issues, whether that be education, economic mobility, health, housing, agriculture, right? A whole range of issues that were mobilized, issues that social entrepreneurs and other innovators were mobilized to address these massive challenging massive challenges around the world. Whereas in the democracy and governance space, it felt that this field that I just talked about was completely disconnected from that world, right? So it was very policy centric, advocacy centric, and which are really important levers, but we needed to infuse it with more the innovation, the kind of a lot of the systems and approaches that were developed to support social entrepreneurs. How do we bring that with the really incredible work that's being done to strengthen and defend democracies around the world? So long story short, informed by that, but also the deepening crisis we face in our democracy, Freedom House just released their report that shows that over the course of now 18 years, freedom around the world has continued to decline. That is not to say that we should lose hope, because what we're seeing is that there are simultaneously, as we know, because there are lots of people here who are doing really incredible, innovative, and impactful work in many contexts, that, while there are democracy innovations and approaches that are working, we're also continuing to see the deterioration of democracy. And what we have come to understand, and that essentially informed the founding of CASEB, is also these are global challenges. Similar to how we talk about climate as being a global challenge, it is also really important for us to recognize that the crisis of democracy is also global. And while it may manifest in specific and unique ways in different contexts, I think it's important that we see it as both a national challenge as well as a transnational challenge. And in that, I think the US plays a really critical role, because historically, the US has been a promoter of democracy in the international arena. However, the field of democracy domestically has been completely disconnected from the work that US organizations have done abroad. And so these various elements, how do we bring more innovation and bring the democracy sector and connect it broadly to the social innovation ecosystem? How do we really tap into the innovation that's already happening within the democracy space? And then how do we look at this not just as a national problem, but also a transnational both challenge and opportunity? So these are the core insights that led to the formation of CASEB, which is the organization I founded and lead. And we have a two-pronged mission. One is to counter authoritarianism, and the other is to advance inclusive and resilient democracies. And we do that by merging a few types of approaches, including from venture philanthropy, from think tanks, as well as we hope to also really be a contributor as a movement catalyst. I'll pause here. I can share more about our impact initiatives, but I thought it might be more helpful to talk about just some of the reasons why we exist, as opposed to just the work that we're doing today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I love what you said too about the crisis of democracy as a global crisis, because it has significant impacts. And so, I really appreciate that. And I'm hearing we want a functional government, we want an inclusive government. All of this work that we're doing is hoping to foster change through those two avenues. And Jennifer, I want to bring you in because you co-founded an organization called Compassion in Politics. When I heard that, I'm in public office and I was like, oh my gosh, where do I sign up for that? That sounds great. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that organization is all about, and what were you seeing happen around the UK that led to the creation of this organization?
Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be with you all and hear everyone else talking. And just to pick up quickly on what Jordana said, the problems that we face nationally are international problems. Climate change, inequity, all of these issues are international, and we have to work at a global level. And what we have found in the UK is very similar to what's happening in the States: increased polarization, increased toxicity, increased levels of threat, particularly to women, and the extent to which the party system that we operate in exacerbates that division. We have at first past the post binary system of democracy. And when, the US and the UK have been the big colonizers in terms of democracy, but the model that they have exported is one that is really not fair, and that leaves at least half the people without their votes being represented when you have a first past the vote post system. So that leads to a binary system, it leads to an adversarial system, it leads to a conflict-based system. And what I found, I sat on the national executive of the Green Party in the UK, having been an activist since my teens. And what I encountered was levels of toxicity and conduct, even in the kind of camp of the good guys, that would be unacceptable in any other space and would not be tolerated in business or colleges or workplaces. And so I took a step back and I really said, what is going on here? And two things came up. One is what we bring to the political space, the unhealed trauma that we bring, the unhealed trauma that we act out of, and the egos and the ego defenses that we bring. And we bring them into, certainly in the United Kingdom, an adversarial system of politics where it's one side sitting opposite the other side and engaged in a tug of war over ideologies. No one is actually saying, how do we solve this problem? How do we reduce avoidable suffering? How do we raise living standards? How do we make sure that everyone has enough to eat? How do we make sure that those who arrive on our shores fleeing persecution are welcomed and cared for? No one is trying to solve those problems. Instead, we are having a binary tug of war over whose ideology and whose solutions are going to win, which feeds directly into what Marjan was saying about other forms of democracy, deliberative democracy, where we can arrive at more complex solutions. So we really took a step back and said, instead of engaging in this binary tug of war, what are the values and what is the purpose of politics? And for me, the purpose of politics is to address the systemic causes of avoidable suffering. Suffering is inevitable in life, but so much suffering that exists is directly caused by human failure or government inaction. So how can we address that? And to address that, we have to go back to what politics is about, the alleviation of suffering, the care and provision for all citizens in a genuinely inclusive fashion. So we decided to work on a cross-party basis with all those who wanted to promote a more compassionate culture. And pretty quickly, we had 100, there are only 650 members of Parliament in the UK, and we had over 100 of them signed up to try and change the way they work. And so we really look at two things. One is the way politics is conducted. It's conflict-based, it's patriarchal. There are no rules about honesty in politics. We've just had a bill debated on the floor of the House, which would make it an offence to deliberately lie. Those rules exist in all sorts of other professions, but they don't exist in politics. There are some quite simple commonplace tweaks that we could introduce, for example, insisting that politicians tell the truth and don't deliberately misrepresent their policies to gain electoral advantage. I mean, it's really not rocket science. The other thing we can do is change things like the ethics. We have no independent oversight of ethics in the UK. We have ethical standards, but the person who enforces them is the Prime Minister. So no Prime Minister, we've discovered over time, is going to get rid of people who are there propping them up. So there are some really basic fixes that in any other field of life would just be no-brainers and yet aren't applied to the political system. So that's one half of our work, how politics is done, whether it's genuinely inclusive, which it isn't. There are so many barriers for women. Don't even talk about what happened when a member of Parliament brought a newborn baby into the chamber and needed to breastfeed her, and how that was received. And then the other part is, how can we have governments that pass laws that we know will inflict harm on the most vulnerable in society, and yet they pass them and they enact them, and harm is caused, even though it was completely foreseeable. And so we really argue that governments have a duty of care to their citizens, and when they pass measures that inflict foreseeable harm on those who are already in vulnerable circumstances, that just can't be allowed. And similarly for future generations, how can we dissipate the resources that we have now without thought to those who come afterwards? We're custodians, and we need to be servant leaders, not patriarchal, dominant, winner-takes-all leaders.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. All of you are busy. Thank you for being here because there's a lot going on. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time to sit with us and to talk about the incredible work that you're doing, because there is so much happening. I know it's very rich for our audience as well. And I think it's really clear from all of your work too, that the theme is just you're doing things in a different way. You've taken things into your own hands. You're creating the environment that you want to see, the environment that we all deserve. So I want to pose this question to the group. Marjan, I'm going to start with you, but I'm opening it up to anybody. Can you share a little bit more about accountability? Because I think that word's been talked about a lot too. What's the process of holding governments accountable with deliberative democracy? And can you share some success stories about what that looks like and how some of our viewers could actually get involved in that movement as well?
Sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Wow, Jennifer, I just loved everything you said, that duty of care, and just beautiful. And I do want to mention that one of the things that I found the most interesting is actually when we have citizens' assemblies that include members of parliament. In Brussels, for instance, they deliberate together, and it is incredible how the members of parliament leave completely changed, because they have an opportunity to actually speak and work on proposals together with people from other parties, which they don't do in their normal day adversarial kind of lives. So lovely to hear that. I think that the way that we do this is, as I mentioned, I mean, one of the pieces that's really important with the Citizens Assembly is that they be initiated or commissioned by a government body. So when the government body commissions this, we make sure that they are ready and willing to move the needle on that policy. And that is really, really important. So for instance, last year I was involved on a citizens convention on the end of life in France, which met over 9 weekends, 27 days. We had 185 citizens from all over France attend. We only lost one person, I always like to say, one person out of 185. So for those people who say people aren't really interested, citizens really don't want to get involved, when they know that they actually are asked to do something meaningful, they will show up over and over again. And so in that case, President Macron had made a commitment that if re-elected, he would change the law around the end of life. And he would ask citizens if they wanted to change the format around assisted suicide and euthanasia. And so we brought citizens together over 27 days. And in the end, after much deliberation, we had about 70% in favor of a change in the law. We met at the Elysee with President Macron. He made a commitment that by the end of the summer, and that hasn't happened, but the commitment was that by the end of the summer, he asked for a legal framework to be introduced to change the law as per the recommendations of the Citizens Assembly. And so we're still waiting for that change in the law, but that's not to say that the government hasn't been held accountable. There is a commitment that things will change. Our understanding, I was just with the group that we worked with in France last week, the change will be coming in the next month and a half, and then it will obviously take about a year for it to change. But to answer the question, that is how we hold them accountable. The groups themselves that form the panelists and the participants of the citizens' assemblies will often create a little club at the end of their participation, whether it's over 4 weekends or over, in this case, 4 months, which was kind of a very, very sort of long process. And they will then make sure that they lobby the government. So they will push and push and push, and we give them the tools to do that. So I think the fact that government commissions it and we make sure that there are follow-up mechanisms. So when you produce the proposals, for instance, we will make sure that that government body is there to receive the proposals. And in that presentation, over the course of the presentation, they will make a commitment that they will come back to citizens within 6 months, 9 months, sometimes sooner. But those follow-up mechanisms are sort of ensure that at least we can hold government accountable.
Thank you for that. And Jordanos and Jennifer, anything to add in terms of accountability that you'd like to share with our group?
Yeah, perhaps I'll offer some comments kind of at the meta level, which is that, one of the organizations that we support, they talk about democracy being 365 days, right? It's not something you engage in only during election cycles. Democracy is, as John and Jennifer are saying, like, it's an ongoing process, a deliberative process. It's something that you commit to and engage in on a daily basis. And then the question becomes, how do we create those mechanisms, right? We wake up every day thinking about democracy, but for a lot of people, it's something that they exist in or they're trying to achieve, right? And they have a whole host of other priorities that they're navigating in their daily lives. And so for us at CUSEB, because we operate and, as I would say at the field level, so we're really building an ecosystem that connects and supports leading democracy champions from different contexts. And so the way I would answer this question is some of the priorities that we've identified in our analysis, which we distilled into a report last year, which is that you need to build, first and foremost, you need to build trust in the system for people to really engage in it and commit to it, right? And how do you do that? Well, some of the things that we found to be priorities, particularly in the short term, by short term, I mean, when we conducted this research initially in 2022 to, this through the end of this mega election cycle that we're in right now, where, close to 4 billion countries with, populations of more than 4 billion people are engaging in consequential elections. And so kind of the categories I want to lift up: one, we need elections that are free and fair, but are also trusted, right? Not only that they happen, but the results are actually seen as legitimate. The second is that we need political leaders that are representative. Part of the reason people don't trust the system is because they don't see themselves reflected in the political leaders in office. And then just really quickly, the other is we need healthier information ecosystems. And then last but not least, we need people to be informed, and we need to have different mechanisms to engage them outside of the voting process. That's why I'm really excited about citizen assemblies and other models that really engage citizens and really give them the how, not just the message that you need to engage, but really make that an accessible pathway. Sorry for taking so long.
Oh, everything you said was spot on. So thank you. Jennifer, anything to add before we go into some Q&A?
Yeah, really, we talk about old politics and new politics, and old politics is the system that has got us to where we are now, the brink of catastrophe, and new politics is led by female qualities, deliberative democracy, inclusion, psychologically safe spaces. But what traditional Democrats say is that politics is accountable because we can vote our representative out every 4 years, and that simply isn't good enough. We need to have MPs that can be recalled. We need to have enforceable rules. And what I observe is not that people have drifted away from politics, but that politics has drifted away from the values that most of us live by. Most of us take care of our families. We don't dissipate what we have in the family without thought of future generations. We don't throw our grandmother out when she ceases to be of economic value. And what we need is for politicians to come back to the values that we live by and to be anchored in them.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate it. I'm blown away. I'm just capturing all of the things that you're saying. So thank you so much. And I want to go into Q&A. I'm looking at the time, and we have probably 8 or 9 minutes left. So in terms of Q&A, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them in, and we will just jump in. And this is a small enough group where, if you have a question that you would like to jump in on, just feel free to do so. But I will go with the first one that I see, which is: how do you think gender balance and women's representation factor into challenging the status quo and crafting a new way of governing? I mean, we're women, we're brave, we're bold. So does women's representation and challenging of the status quo just automatically go hand in hand? I kind of think that they do, but I want to know, how do those two things intersect with one another? And Jennifer, I already see you with a hand.
I know, so I have to come in here because when I started, I'm quite old now. And when I started, we only had 90 women in Parliament. And we thought all we need is to get more women in Parliament, and then it's going to change. So we now have 225 women, which is 35%, which is still a lot more than when I started. But it's the system. You can pour as many women as you want into a patriarchal system. That system needs to change. And it's very difficult for a minority of women to change a system that is designed really to exclude them. As Namate said in her opening remarks, it's a male space. It's conducted in ways that are not conducive to those who have caring responsibilities. So it isn't just a numbers game, it's a systems game as well. But of course, the more women we have, the better the chance of changing the system. But it is the system that needs to change.
Absolutely. Marjan Yordanos, anything to add?
No, I think Jennifer covered it for me.
Incredible. I agree. It's as simple and not simple as that. I want to go into the next question that I see in terms of learning. So, what are some major learnings from your work that you can share with the group, especially on the incredible things that you've created? What have you learned along the way that would be valuable advice for those of us that are watching and learning and really wanting to get involved as well? Yeah, Marjan, did I see you put your hand up?
I mean, I'm happy to go with a couple, and then
Yeah.
I'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts. I mean, I think one of the things that I've learned is that learning changes people. I think that that's one of the draws for me for around citizens assemblies. I mean, I'll be honest, I came to citizens assemblies for my doctoral thesis, and my question, I had a very simple question, which was, why are citizens so disengaged from political institutions, and are there democratic innovations that once they participate just make them want to engage with their politicians and their government more? And I came to find deliberative democracy and then citizens assemblies. I have seen over and over again how, we often in the US, we say we can't do anything about polarization. And I'm not saying it isn't a really, really big issue. It's really hard to overcome, but we're not going to get there by just kind of creating more and more bubbles and just kind of not speaking to each other. And the speaking can't just be speaking at the community level. It also has to be government mandated. Government has to take responsibility around this. And I completely agree with Jennifer that the system needs to change. And so I have seen that learning just completely transforms people. And I also have seen that, my book that's coming out this summer is called Activated Citizenship, that people want to be more involved. They want to have voice. They are not apathetic when it comes to politics. They're just so discouraged by the fact that they are not being asked to provide meaningful input. So I think we just need to bring them in more and to provide real platforms, meaningful platforms, as I said.
Yeah, I'll share. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, please
No,
go ahead.
you go ahead.
Okay. Three things that I would lift up. One is that I think we talk a lot about defending democracy in the field, and I think we've shifted a little bit to talking about straightening democracy. So not always being having a defensive posture, but also having an offensive posture. I think one of the things that we've learned at CASEP is that, and with our fellows and other democracy champions we've engaged with, as well as our own observation, is that we also need to be in a space, both mentally and also like as a field, to reimagine democracy, right? So how we've done things to date don't always have to be done. We don't have to continue to do things in the same way. And so I think there's a real opportunity for us to certainly defend and strengthen, but also really think about possibilities for 21st century democracy. And that's where I think we really have to be like inventive and be willing to experiment and borrow those kinds of approaches from other fields. The second thing we've learned is that, and I love that this is a global summit, is that there is a real need for cross-border learning, cross-pollination of ideas, and even at the level of relationship building and solidarity cultivation, right? It is part of the authoritarian playbook to make people feel isolated and therefore really susceptible to fear. And so it is important to create these types of spaces to continue to build relationships and transfer knowledge across borders. And the last thing I will say is we also need a part of the kind of reimagining piece. But even I think before we get to the reimagining piece, I think in cases where we are in active wars against authoritarianism and the majority of the world, right, 85% of people live in a context that is not truly free. We need an alternate vision for what's possible. So it's not just about countering the liberal side. It's also about painting a picture of what's possible through democracy. So we're fighting for something and not just against something. And I think that's something that we've heard consistently across borders, particularly in places that have not been successful in dismantling authoritarianism, that having an opposition is simply not sufficient. And I think that's something that we especially need to pay attention to during this mega election year.
I'd love to just pick up on what you said about vision. That is absolutely crucial. And one of the things is that we work with governments and parties and, in fact, cities to create a vision, because if you don't have a vision, you don't have a map of where you want to end up. All you're doing is focusing on what you don't want. And the more you focus on something, the more power and the more strength you give it. So that vision is an absolutely crucial part. I think for me, the biggest thing I learned was at 14 years old, when they were going to build a road through the field by my house in a farming district. And I got out and I held up a placard and I tried to stop the diggers, and I didn't stop the road, and the road was built. But what I learned was that when I took action, I had hope. There is something about taking action. Sitting on the sidelines, it's like jumping into a pool. The more you sit on the edge, the harder it gets to take that step forward. The moment we take action, and it can be tiny, it can be signing a petition, it can be sharing a petition, it can be reaching out to someone, then we start to become part of the solution, and our energy and our sense of agency returns. And just a couple of other things. One is that out of my experiences in the political world, I wrote a book called A Manifesto for Women, as it's International Women's Day tomorrow. And what that looked at is what's the internal work we can do as women to build our resilience and our capacity to engage in the battle ahead, because it is a battle, and how can we take care of ourselves in that and work in a way that's sustainable? You know, we fight for sustainability, but we often do it in ways that leave us vulnerable, that leave us burnt out. And finally, you know, fear is what divides us, and what joins us together is love. And ultimately, the biggest act of rebellion is to practice love with whomever we encounter, whether we agree with them or not. And it is through creating connection that we will strengthen the fabric of our society. And the stronger our communities, the better able we will be to withstand the shocks of totalitarianism, state capture, and the impacts of climate change. So love, corny as it sounds, is absolutely a political act, and it needs to be practiced on a daily basis.
Thank you all so much. Love is a political act. I love that. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all. Looking at the time, we have time for one more question. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the Q&A here. And the top question is, most legislative bodies are not themselves democratic, meaning that there is a centralization of power at the top of the hierarchy. What are some ideas for impacting that in an immediate way and disrupting the consolidation of power in accessible ways, not in a year or a few years, since that's the day-to-day reality for the folks currently serving? Anyone want to jump in and take that one?
I'll just put a plug in here for Democratic Lottery and sortition, because I mean we're nowhere close to there. But I mean, to Jordana's point about a vision, we need a vision. I think until we have that vision, I mean, I see with my own children, I have a 22-year-old and 20-year-old, none of these incredibly smart, remarkable kids want to go into government. And that's really, really sad. But until that vision changes, we are not going to have great people being interested in politics. And so I think that's a huge part of it. The second part that I was just mentioned about democratic lottery is that, you know, one of the beauties of these citizens' assemblies is that we use democratic lottery and sortition. And it is phenomenal to see the way that any body of citizens' assembly people are representative of their community. And while, you know, we still haven't perfected that because it's still voluntary, and so of course there's a bit of self-selection that goes on, but at the end of the day, it is such a diverse body, and no elected body that I know anywhere in the world looks like that. So it would be interesting to think about sort of how to sort of incorporate potentially sort of democratic lottery and sortition into our elected bodies.
Thank you, Marjan. Jordanos or Jennifer, anything to add in the last couple of minutes we have?
Just as a corollary to that, one of the things that we're calling for is government ministers to have to spend time working in the area that they serve. So if you're given the health brief, for example, you then, before you start work, you have to spend a month working in a hospital. If you're given the education brief, you have to spend time there, because we have to bring lived experience into the way that we're governed. And the people that take responsibility can't see these briefs and these portfolios as kind of medals or stepping stones on their career progress. They have to be humanized, and they have to actually have some experience of the areas over which they make decisions.
Thank you. Jordanos, anything to close us out?
Not on this question. I think my colleagues did an excellent job.
Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. It is 4:04, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up at this point. I want to thank you for all of the work that you do. It's incredible. It's inspiring. Thank you for your time. Like I said, you are very busy, so we really appreciate you taking time to come here and share some of your wisdom and experience with us today. I also want to note that there were a couple of requests for links to these organizations in the chat. If you go into the Q&A, into answered questions, you'll be able to see the links to all of these amazing organizations, so you can engage with our panelists as you like. And I just want to again thank Jordanos, Marjan, Jennifer. I really appreciate all of your time. Thank you for the conversation, and I will kick it back over to Alyssa.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you all so much for sharing about how women around the world are just continuing to develop such innovative ways of governing. Let's give them all a virtual round of applause. We will now be taking a quick break, and when we return, we will be joined by Sandra Pepera, Senator Cynthia Lopez Castro, and Natalia Herbst to talk about how to address violence against women and promote mental well-being in politics. We will see you back here in just a minute. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our experts on the solutions to help women help effectively serve in office. This next conversation is about innovations in addressing sexual harassment and mental well-being for women in politics, which we know is an ever-growing issue as more and more women continue to enter the political sphere. Our moderator for this conversation is the wonderful Sandra Pepera. Sandra has built her career as a diplomat and international development professional, and she is currently serving as the Director for Gender, Women, and Democracy at the National Democratic Institute. We are also joined by Natalia Herbst, who is the Director of Latin America Strategy and Development at Apolitical. She is also an Obama Scholar and has over 10 years of experience in government and at the local and national levels. We also have Senator Cynthia Lopez Castro, who is a federal representative for Mexico City and president of the IPU's Women's Caucus. We're still working on getting her into the Zoom, so hopefully she will hop on in a few. But we are so grateful to have all of you with us today. And without further ado, I will pass things over to you, Sandra.
Thanks so much, Alyssa, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, wherever you are. I am so excited. That last panel, I mean, these are women that I have wanted to meet. Victoria, kudos to you, Jordanos, and others, really, names I've seen on reports, I've read about you, and to be part of a conversation that you're part of is hugely important to me. We're going to be talking about violence, and I think some of what we say really kind of reinforces what was touched on in that first piece, which is, you know, why do women need to be in the political space? Just this morning, I was on another panel, and somebody said, well, you know, we can't make the the instrumentalist argument. But we also can't say, well, it's their right, because neither of those have been working, right? So we need to think about the organizing piece. And I think that first panel really, really spoke to innovative areas of organizing. But having said all that, we are still faced with what I would say is some structural violence issues. And I want to just sort of quote two reports that have been launched in the last 2 days from very different organizations. But if you do go to the VDEM report, you're going to hear that 71% of us now all live under autocracies, which is up from 48% barely a decade ago. And I think one of our other colleagues talks about 15 years of systematic regression on the democracy indexes and indices. And on the same time, if you look at the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law Index, they're telling us that women are still only accessing 64% of the rights that men have in the world. So, there are structural issues that are causing damage and violence to us and doing harms to women and girls in all their diversity. And I want to reinforce that, in all their diversity, quite apart from the kind of behavioral issues whereby women are violated in a sort of either a physical or an online way. So I think we're dealing with things in this space that are very, very complicated. And unfortunately, we see no easy end to them. But I'm really interested to hear from Natalia and from the Senator Lopez Castro, what is happening in their spheres and what they think are innovative and breakthrough ways to address some of these issues. So, Natalia, since you are here, why didn't you kick us off and tell us, what are you seeing that is really bringing new energy and new kind of dynamism and hopefully new effectiveness to breaking some of these issues around either the big structural pieces or what I would call the localized behavioral pieces? Take it away.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much, Sandra, for facilitating the conversation this afternoon. I think I would like to start by sharing some of the work that we're doing at Apolitical that we initially started globally, but now we're trying to bring down regionally to Latin America in particular. So we've realized for some time that there's an unspoken issue around politicians' mental well-being. So we decided that it was relevant to do some research and to understand the problem better. But we didn't want to just have a diagnosis, which is interesting, but we also wanted to produce an action-oriented report. We wanted to understand the problem and understand which ways we could start acting and we could start creating coalition in order to address this topic. So we started by talking to 150 key informants, and I want to share with you the definition we used of mental health for this project, which I believe it's very telling of the sense that we are trying to understand and to frame this issue of mental well-being. So for this project, our definition is that mental well-being is defined as a person's psychological functioning, life satisfaction, and ability to develop and maintain mutually beneficial relationships. It includes the ability to maintain a sense of autonomy, self-acceptance, personal growth, purpose in life, and self-esteem. So we want to think about politicians' well-being in a holistic way and not trying to address problems, but how do we create an ecosystem in which people thrive, and because they thrive, they can be better public servants. So the report has 10 main outtakes. It's quite a long report. I'm going to share the link afterwards so that if people want to access it, it's super interesting. But I want to share 4 in particular that I think are the most relevant for me in order to start framing this issue and understanding where we can take action. So one very surprising finding for us is that currently the politicians that we surveyed show lower mental well-being than emergency service, people working in emergency responses. They report at a 41% to have low or very low mental well-being, which is lower than, for example, people working as first responders or police officers that we usually observe as very stressful occupations. So I think it's important to take that as a starting point. A second key finding that we have is that the stress of the job leads to worse decision-making, and then it affects democracy. We have politicians that are currently having to approach a poly-crisis context. They have to think, whenever they make decisions about policy or about politics, they have to think about climate change. They should be thinking about gender inequality. They have to be thinking about conflict in many regions of the world. And all these issues require creativity. They require problem solving. They require long-term thinking. And whenever people report that they are feeling a diminished mental well-being, it's harder for them to think in this way, to think collaboratively, to think creatively. But the upside is that they also are very aware of this. So this means that they keep seeking spaces to make themselves their better selves in order to serve to their communities. A third aspect, and I promise the fourth will be very positive, but some are a little bit more negative, which is why we need to address this issue. A third relevant aspect that we found in our research is that there is a very high cost towards politicians' mental well-being of the public's misconception about their work. There are a lot of misconceptions about how much politicians get paid, about their working hours, about how many decision-making power they have, and about this whole idea of that all politicians are the same. And this relates, I find, when this came out in the report, it was very personal to me because I spent 10 years in government, and I wasn't an elected official, but when you are in government, you understand very quickly that even if you're part of a political space, of a party, and you're part of an administration that asks to be elected and approach citizens to trust them based on a program that they proposed, within government, you have people who have their own worldviews, who are struggling to balance positions towards what they believe is best, and it may not always be the position of the majority of their party. It's like as if there was this idea that everyone that works in government goes to sleep in their desk drawer and wakes up, and they are just that. People are like multifaceted. They have their life experiences. They have their own worldview, and many times they are looking to form coalitions with people from outside of government that will help them push their agendas within government. So this whole idea that they are all the same or they are not doing enough, it's very detrimental to the way in which they can approach the communities and the way that they can approach their work. And a fourth finding that I think it's relevant as well is that in spite of all these issues, politicians continue to see serving as a privilege. They are very aware that many people want to represent their constituencies, that many people have ideas of what they think is best for their community, and that they have had the opportunity to go and present those ideas and people trusted them. So even if sometimes they are aware that it's hard, or they feel that some of the dynamics or the gap between what they actually do and what the public gets to see is to some extent unfair or detrimental to their mental well-being, they still consider it a privilege and they still want to pursue producing positive impacts for their communities.
That's just absolutely fabulous. I haven't ever heard any research along those lines, Natalia, and what you're telling us is really eye-opening. You can see some of the comments in the chat. I think, of all you said, all of it fabulous, but this issue of the poly-crisis context, I think that is so, it's universal. It's helpful because we're all in that space, right? We may not have the other spaces to the same levels, but that poly-crisis context for decision-making and political capacity is massive. And I think one of the things that I've over time come to really appreciate is the issue of societal trauma as well. So here you've actually listed out sort of what you heard from individuals, but individuals in certain societies are just living a societal trauma. I was privileged to spend some time as the head of the British program in Rwanda, and we're going into April. And, every April, the whole society relives the trauma of the genocide. and you just know that, okay, this is something different, and we haven't really ever thought about that and how that needs to get addressed. So I'm really interested by what you said. So you have the findings. I have to ask you, what do we do about it? How do we address
Oh,
these? What are the ways
yeah.
to addressing these issues?
So I think something that it's a little bit counterintuitive is that there are many things that are already happening. There are the low-hanging fruit. And the thing is, because we're used to thinking about mental health as something being like issues around mental health. We are used to thinking about something being wrong and needing to fix it. Our framing of what actually constitutes a mental well-being program has been limited by that. So what we found in the report is that some of what politicians say in terms of what they would need in terms of mental well-being is actually life coaching or therapy, which is like what would come to mind first. Many others came up with examples of things that, at least for me, it wouldn't have been my first guess, which are like peer-to-peer networks, mentoring, trainings. They feel that these spaces create connections for them, create better knowledge, creates legitimacy of what they are doing. For example, I was part of a mentoring I worked at the government of the city of Buenos Aires until a year ago. And when I was there, I was part of a mentoring program in which the Minister of Education mentored me. It was a program for women leaders within the government, and the Minister of Education mentored me for a whole year. And while I was going through it, while it was a great experience for me, I never thought about it as a mental well-being or related to my mental health. So I think it's great to know that that also supports people in office, that's something that they need. And it's something that is happening in many places already. And knowing that this is part of the mental well-being space also helps us to think, what else can we add? What modules, what contents we can add to those programs that in general are already offered. At the Political Foundation ourselves, two things that are interesting and that I would love to share that we are doing in that space in Latin America are, one is we are starting to pilot a project with a collaborating organization from East Europe that is called Trollwall. This is an AI-powered content moderator on social media that tries to mitigate the effect of troll campaigns against any particular account. We are looking to test it in the region, specifically with female politicians, which we know are sexualized and attacked at a higher rates than other politicians in general online. And the second program, we are currently in the process of finishing the design process, and we are going to start implementation soon. We are doing it with great counterparts in the region, like AUNA in Mexico and Politiconas and Civics in Colombia, is starting to think, how can we train a new generation of political campaigners? We know we talk a lot about people once that they are in office, but we think we need to start changing the culture since the electoral process. And for that, we think it's really important to start to create a new culture around campaigning in which we approach both our political opponents and the constituencies in a more positive way. We create different kinds of conversations that can also create more hope and connection between constituencies and candidates that they can actually trust, and they can be happy to choose into office, and then they can be happy to held accountable once they are in office.
Thank you so much, Natalia. On that last point, very quickly and briefly, are you looking at men as well as women for that new generation of political campaigners?
Yes. You mean for the campaigners or for the we think the campaigners should be broad. We are trying to work with females running for office, but the campaigners should not only be women.
Okay, great. I'm going to switch very quickly to Senator Cynthia Lopez Castro. So good to have you. Thank you so much for sticking with it and finally getting online. We've been talking whilst waiting for you about the issues around violence, and I think you will agree we all suffer from structural violence, which is to do with that deep-seated gender inequality, but we're also dealing with behavioral types of violence. And Natalia was talking about research that they did that indicated the levels of trauma that women in politics actually carry with them, and the question of their mental well-being. I know that you in Mexico have been really pioneering the whole area around outlawing violence against women in politics, and particularly the issue of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. So please give us your thoughts on how we, what you know about the trauma, because I'm sure if you're prepared to share your own personal histories in this area, that would be wonderful. But also things that you've seen that can help address that trauma. So over to you, Senator Castro.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I'm very happy to be here. I send you a big hug from Mexico. Also, Natalia from A Political Foundation. I say hello to everyone. Kathy, that you were with me all this time. Thank you so much, and thanks for connecting. I would like to talk about Ley Olimpia. So in Mexico, we make we make this law, we make this law, it's called Ley Olimpia, that refers a series of legal reforms aimed at combating cyberbullying, online harassment, and the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, commonly known as revenge porn. So this term of Ley Olimpia, this term of Ley Olimpia, it was originated by Olimpia Coral Melo, that is a Mexican now activist. It was a young woman who experienced the unauthorized dissemination of explicit images and videos of a former partner. So as a result of this unfortunate event, she formed an organization that is called Women Against Violence in her hometown, that is Puebla. So what we made with this law is, let me tell you that the story, when Olimpia went to the Office of the Justice in Mexico, they say, yeah, but it's no crime. Like, it was your boyfriend. There is no crime. So until that, Olimpia's case, which gained the widespread attention in Mexico and internationally, various states within Mexico. So what would we do with Olimpia's law? So now, if you send a photo to your friend, to your boyfriend, to whatever, and he or she share, it's a crime in Mexico. So it's a crime. So now it's not allowed, because it's like our content, it's our it's our responsibility, and it's our content, not yours. So now what we did in the law is to put criminalize this digital violence as a crime. So now in Mexico, if someone shares some content, even though a woman send it to that person, it's a crime. So this Olimpia law, it has been a very successful law in Mexico. It was very complicated to approve, because now we have like more legal resources for the victims, and a lot of members of parliament were like doubt about this topic. But let me tell you about what is this. So it's criminalized a non-consensual sharing of intimate images or videos. So the law's penalties on individuals who share private, intimate content without consent. So all the topic of Olimpia's law is no content without consent. So penalties range from 3 to 6 years in prison. I think the penalties are still low. And we have also they have to pay between $3,000 and $6,000. I think the penalties are still low, but well, that's the beginning. So we provide a legal recourse for victims. So victims of cyberbullying or non-consensual images sharings are granted legal mechanism to seek justice, and also facilitate the removal of the offending content. So now, for example, Google, Yahoo, and all the web, if they have to take out these videos, for example, YouTube and all the platforms, the digital platforms, with this law in Mexico, they mandatory have to remove this content if it's the if someone is asking for to put it down. So, and also is to raise awareness and educate the public. So in addition to these legal reforms, the Olympia initiatives often involve educational campaigns. So, for example, in the Congress, like most of the MPs, with the 500 members of parliament, they have to know about this Olympia's law, and is considered a cornerstone in the legal landscape of Mexico for several reasons, like protection of human rights by criminalizing the non-consensual sharing of intimate image, addressing a growing problem. So empowering victims, and of course setting a legal precedent that is Olympia law is set a legal precedent for other countries grappling with similar issues. I want to tell you that I'm very happy because Argentina just approved this law in the past month. So we are very happy about that. And well, about 83% more or less of the cases filed with the authorities remain in process and may remain so many years. In Mexico City, there were only 5 convictions from crime against sexuality intimacy between 21 and 23. So now they are increasing the numbers because now it's a crime. So I would like to finish this intervention telling that in Mexico, I am now a member of parliament. I'm running for senator from Mexico City right now. And one of our priorities is to criminalize digital violence. So now, as you see, we have the Olympia, but we need also to improve the penalties, to put it more penalties. It could not be 3 to 6 years. We need to be more years in jail for people that's doing this. We are against that they can pay a fee because we think that we need to do more about that. It's not just to pay a fee and that's all, because the damage is too much. So I would like to tell you that we feel very proud about this Olympia's law. It was quite difficult to approve in the Congress because, you know, we have a lot of men that it were like, oh no, we don't want to approve this because tomorrow you will say that everything is a crime. So they said that all the time. But we are fighting to promote gender equality. Mexico is one of the 6 countries in the world with parity, like Rwanda, United Emirates, Arab Emirates, like Cuba, Nicaragua, also Rwanda also. So we are very proud, as also Natalia. So we are very proud to have gender equality. We have parity in the Chamber of Deputies. We have parity in the Senate. What we need now to have a women in the decision-making process. So thank you so much for this space. I don't know if we have time to answer some questions, but if not, just to tell you, thank you so much, and let's work together against violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Really, that was fantastic. And I think interesting things that both of you and Natalia spoke about. One is breaking the isolation that people feel, number one. And second is filling a legal gap. I mean, Ley Olympia, you said it. There was nothing there before. And now you have legal remedy. I will say, I don't know if anybody from India is on our Solution Summit today, but I understand that in India, there is no law about defaming a woman. You can defame a man, but you can't actually defame a woman. So when it comes to things like gender disinformation, you see that there's a big gap even in the legal infrastructure. So I'm really pleased that we were able to have this conversation. I think we all learned a lot from it. I hope that, next time we meet, Cynthia, you'll be able to tell us about the implementation rates continuing to grow, because that's another thing we know, that even though women are still only accessing 64% of the rights of men, when it comes to implementation, even that falls to 40%, because the implementation of those laws for protection and so forth for women even undermine further the statutory protection that they have. So thank you all for sticking with us. We're so sorry we couldn't have had Q&A this time, but it's such a dynamic conversation. We're really looking forward to the next session, and I really appreciate being here. My apologies for my throat. It's a bit croaky. I don't know what's going on with it, but I'm also very excited. So handing it back to you, Alyssa. Thank you. And moving on, Natalia, Cynthia, thank you. Gracias. Muy bueno. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much to our experts, Sandra, Natalia, and Senator Lopez Castro, for discussing these solutions that we know address some of the specific challenges that women are facing and can truly upgrade our current system. What an amazing conversation, truly. After the break, we will be wrapping up the day with a conversation with Vandanika Shukla, Dr. Jennifer Piscopo, and Australian Member of Parliament Kate Cheney, who will discuss a few electoral solutions used internationally to help build a stronger democracy and level the playing field for women candidates. We will see you back here in 1 minute. Welcome back. We have made it to the final session of the 2024 Democracy Solutions Summit. I cannot believe we're already here. For our last discussion of the day, we will be diving into how gender quotas in Latin America and Australia's single transferable voting system are two incredible examples of policies and reforms that will build a 21st century democracy. I'm excited to introduce our moderator for this discussion, Vandanika Shukla, Represent Women's Board Chair and Gender Policy Specialist. She has spent the last decade designing national gender policies and advocacy campaigns at UN Women, building public interest technology products and partnerships at MIT Media Lab, and founding organizations to amplify unheard stories for stronger democracies. So just a few really little things. And speaking with Vandanika today is Dr. Jennifer Piscopo, who is a professor of gender and politics at Royal Holloway University of London. She is a leading expert on gender and politics, especially women's political representation in Latin America and the United States and around the world. Also joining the conversation is MP Kate Cheney, member of the Australian House of Representatives. Kate is Western Australia's first female independent federal member of the Parliament and House. And she is also still in the process of getting on, so we hope to have her joining in just a few minutes. Thank you all so much again for being here today, and I will hand things over to you, Vandanika.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's been such a lively, enriching conversation. I've been sort of taking notes and, plus running a lot of the conversations on the chat. And it's such a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Piscopo, on this panel. Welcome, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation together, and also with MP Kate Cheney coming soon. I wanted to just, I think maybe we can kickstart a conversation and then have Kate join in a little bit. Today has been about shifting paradigms of power and women's leadership around the world, and what can we learn from global models of successes, of struggles, of failures, and how can we embody that here? What do we learn about the types of advocacy and movements and legal frameworks that we need to really shift the conversation? And after these conversations with experts on reconceptualizing leadership and addressing violence against women and mental well-being in politics, which is really important for the sort of thriving in politics piece, we will round out the day with our conversation on gender quotas and the single transferable voting system. And we have some of the best in terms of experts here to talk about what can we learn from them and how can we reach that strong example. So before we begin, in the US, we use a winner-take-all voting system, and perhaps gender quotas may feel very far off or something new. For those who might not be familiar, I want to share gender quotas are numerical targets that stipulate the number or percentage of women that must be included in a candidate list, or the number of seats to be allocated to women in legislature. So, for example, since the early 1990s in my home country, India, Sandra, I heard your shout out on such an important point there. India has reserved 1/3 of village council leadership positions for women. And many states have increased that to half, seeing the impact that it has created. And after 27 years of advocacy and movements, last September, India passed a landmark bill requiring the lower house of parliament, known as the Lok Sabha, the Delhi Legislative Assembly, and state legislative assemblies across the country to set aside 1/3 of their seats for women. We're going to see how the execution and implementation pans out. It might take a few years, given that it is linked to redrawing of the constituency boundaries, but it's a big win in terms of the way that we want representation going forward. And with regards to the single transferable voting system, I know that this call perhaps has many experts who could define this much better than I can, but just for the interest of the audience, proportional ranked choice voting, commonly known as a single transferable vote, gives voters the option to rank candidates in order of their preference. So once voters have the option to rank their candidates, their vote may be transferred according to alternate preferences if their preferred candidate is, for example, eliminated or elected with surplus votes, so that their vote is used to elect someone they prefer over others in the running. So with that brief introduction, I want to go to you, Dr. Piscopo, and really understand from you on your experience of studying gender quotas. How have they been effective in level playing the field and removing barriers to building women's political power, and how that really relates to strengthening democracies in different parts of the world?
Great, thank you so much, Nanika, and thank you so much to Represent Women for this fantastic conversation. It's really exciting to be here. So going to the question, one of the major lessons across the globe over the past few decades is that women struggle to receive nominations from their political parties to run for office. This is true no matter the country, no matter the context, no matter the electoral system. And it's not necessarily that voters will not vote for women, but political parties are often closed networks. They are largely and historically closed networks of men. And we know that closed networks tend to recruit and support and encourage the people who look like them. And so historically, and even today, it is very difficult for women to make inroads into political parties and to attain those nominations. So as women's movements became more empowered in the 1970s, the 1980s, and 1990s, and sort of the contemporary era of the third wave of democratization, they quickly identified this problem, and they began asking for rules that would require political parties to extend the nominations to women that parties were not doing on their own. And so you have a wave starting in the 1990s of these gender quota laws that spread from Latin America and rapidly across the globe. So gender quotas are a really important initial step to raise the number of women that run for and enter congressional and parliamentary office. But of course, they're not the last step, and they're not the only step. They work in different ways. We can talk about the different ways that they work. They've been more successful in some places than others because of the way that they are designed to fit or not fit with the electoral system. But the bottom line is that they do provide a very important corrective to political parties' reluctance to nominate women and their continued belief, incorrect, that women are not ready for office, that voters won't choose them, that women aren't qualified and prepared.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think that changes so much of the access points that women can have to run for office to begin with, and then actually challenge some of these sort of preconceived notions that people don't want them in office. Well, they do, but once they have the ticket. I think one of the things that you said about right at the end about the different systems coexisting, I was curious, some might believe that proportional representation voting systems solve representation issues. And can you tell the audience why gender quotas are still essential, even in voting systems like proportional representations, which often are an improvement of winner-take-all systems?
Sure, right. So in proportional representation systems in general, right, you have multi-member districts. Parties can field multiple candidates in the district, and they're most traditionally going to field those candidates in a list. And then the party wins a proportion of votes that then translates into a proportion of seats on that list, right? So it is true that when parties can run candidates in multi-member districts and they can present multiple candidates, parties have the incentive to do what we call ticket balancing, right? Which means they're going to present a broader, more diverse slate, right? They don't just have to give one nomination away that they will give to, the man who's been their tap to run all along. They have multiple nominations to give away, so they will diversify their slate. So it's true that proportional representations systems on average elect more women than single member district systems. However, right, even in proportional representation systems, parties can manipulate the list, particularly if it's a closed list, meaning parties rank order the candidates on the list, and there's no preference vote for voters to cast for individual candidates on the list. So we look at that list and we say there are three kinds of spots on that list. There's safe spots, winnable spots, right? There's the competitive spots that maybe the party will get to elect the candidates far enough down the list if they do particularly well. And then there's the losing spots, right? As I always say to my students, if it's a 10-seat district and you're number 10 on the list, that means the party has to win 100% of the votes to get all the way down to the list. You don't feel great about being number 10, right? That's what we call an ornamental spot. You're just there for window dressing. So even in the absence of quotas, parties could diversify their lists, but they could strategically place their less preferred candidates, women, but also racial ethnic minorities, women of color, right, down in those spots on the list that are less likely for candidates to win. So one of the important things that needed to happen when gender quotas were introduced in proportional representation systems was they needed to include what we call placement mandates, which requires parties to fill the quota by actually placing women in the more electable, winnable, or competitive spots on the list. So that's been an enormously important aspect of quota laws. It's an enormously important sort of rule within the quota law to translate the quota into a proportion of women that is actually elected, not just running.
Thank you so much for that. And that's such an important nuance to both the proportional ranked choice system and how the gender quotas are operating in real life. And I think you raised a really interesting point about the window dressing, right? Of how a lot of the times legislations are sort of in paper or in name only. And I was curious, there have been, as I've been tracking them, and including often in historically in my country as well, there have been some disappointing results in some countries that have passed forms of gender quota legislation, and that may not entirely result in the kind of representation we want. And sometimes we also see that challenge of we have parity in number, but the exercise of power and decision making may be coming from somewhere else. And like you said, in the ballot, if you're number 10, your chances of winning or being in a competitive election are lower. And I was curious, what are some lessons learned there that the rest of us should know about, from your research in different examples around the world, implementing and passing gender quota legislation?
Sure. I mean, I think we can think about the glass being half full, and then we could think about what is the activism we need to fill the other part of the glass, right? So any improvement on women's descriptive representation is an improvement on women's descriptive representation, by which I mean the number of women that are elected. And so it is absolutely true that because of some of these design features I mentioned just a minute ago, that in some cases, right, a 30% quota or even gender parity, which we could think of as a 50% quota, applies to the candidates, and so then it doesn't necessarily translate to 30% women elected or gender parity in women elected, because parties could say, use some of these, what we call the escape valves or the loopholes, if they're not prevented from doing so. So any gain in women's representation is important, even if it falls short of some of the expected gains when a gender quota or a gender parity law is adopted. And in fact, what we see in most of the countries across the globe is that often the initial quota law that is adopted is quite weak. It doesn't include those placement mandates, for instance. It doesn't include some of the other mechanisms that are needed to really make the law enforced or effective. But some women are elected in that first round, and they have a very strong incentive to make sure that the quota law is reformed to be stronger over time and to become more effective. And so what we actually have across the globe is not just a wave of quota adoption, but a wave of quota reform and quota strengthening. The vast majority of countries actually reform their quota law at least once to introduce a lot of these additional rules, these additional mechanisms, because you get some women who get their foot in the door, and they're going to undertake many important actions in Parliament, but one really important action that they're going to undertake, and that actually facilitates what we call across the aisle collaboration, is action to elect more women, right? And so they will often, put in bills that will make the quota laws stronger. So what I always tell policymakers and activists, it's actually okay if the first law is not perfect. And it's actually okay if the first law falls short of expectations, because sometimes a weaker law is easier to pass initially. And then it's also easier to strengthen in the next few rounds, because again, some women get their foot in the door. So I know as feminist activists, we often want perfect right away, but I do take heart from looking globally at the number of countries that did not attain perfect right away, but did empower some women to continue fighting for better.
Thank you so much for that. And that's such an essential point that you make about representation of women in politics and women in power itself, right? Of what happens when we have more women taking those decisions in those decision-making spaces to shift the way that we think about gender quota reform specifically, or other policy areas as well, in terms of shifting the narrative, pushing for more, and the point that you raise about sort of it is a scaffolding, it's a triage process, and we can't sort of striving for the perfect might delay some of the progress that we can actually achieve right now. So thank you for that perspective. And in that spirit, I think in terms of what advocates can do, what policymakers can do, I was curious, historically, what have been the successful pathways to legislating gender quotas or implementing single transferable voting systems in other countries that our listeners in the United States can learn from? And, it goes to the same question of what support is most needed from advocates on the ground that can be leveraged when someone is in office, for example, or is in the legislative system.
Yeah, I mean, quota advocates have been extremely effective at pointing out, right, that women's political underrepresentation, and I would additionally add, of course, the political underrepresentation of any minoritized or marginalized social group, people of color, people with disabilities, etc., have been very important at pointing out that these gaps in political representation are democratic deficits, right? That our political institutions that make decisions for all of our citizens need to look like all of our citizens. That is what democracy, that's the realization of a better and stronger democracy. And that the gaps in representation, the reasons that women are politically underrepresented, are actually structural, right? So they are democratic flaws, right? They are flaws that are perpetuated over time. And so quota advocates say that gender quotas and gender parity sort of ameliorate these democratic deficits. And these claims are normative, meaning they're appealing to normative ideals about democracy, but they're also backed by research, right? So my research with my co-authors actually shows that, for instance, if we show respondents, and we've done this study in Latin America, we've done it in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and across Europe, if we show people a picture of an all-male decision-making body, and then we show them a picture of a decision-making body that has gender parity, and then we ask them, which do you think is more legitimate? People always choose the decision-making body with gender parity, right? So institutions where men are overrepresented are not seen as legitimate. And this is actually even true if we tell them that the gender parity in the decision-making body was attained via a quota rule. And yes, they like the gender parity in the decision-making body attained via the quota slightly less than they like gender parity without it, but they still like it way more than they like the all-male group. So this is really important because often quota detractors and critics will say, well, you can't have a quota. It works against merit. It undermines democratic legitimacy because it uses criteria like gender to select candidates rather than merit. And that is actually not what we see from voters and respondents across the globe, right? And so gender actually is a qualification because it brings perspectives and it brings diversity into the decision-making process, number one. And number two, we see that respondents perceive the same thing. We see that respondents prefer to see diverse decision-making bodies. So we need to keep making these arguments and keep pushing back against the critics who are defending a status quo that actually isn't a status quo that we believe a lot of voters want to see continue.
Absolutely. And it's like it's so important to also underscore that it is representative. It is representative of the constituency's desires in the kind of democracy that they want to see. And would love to kind of have your research on the chat that we will drop in. And I also saw Cynthia drop in some of the resources from Represent Women on the memo as well. We have a few questions from the audience that I'd love to take one or two of as before we wrap up. You were talking about some of the structural constraints and issues in terms of the democratic deficits. And I wanted to raise Kristen Vogel's question around what cultural elements do you find countries that implement gender quotas have in common? And inversely, what cultural elements tend to prevent countries from implementing gender quotas? And I'm also curious, is that a variable that you have seen play out in your research as well?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that the question of sort of culture and sort of attitudes towards gender roles and attitudes towards women's representation comes up a lot, and it feels sort of really intuitive and explanatory. But we look at gender quotas and gender parity laws, and we see them adopted in a wide variety of countries, right? And countries that have sort of different images in the popular imagination relative to their cultural views on women, right? I mean, gender quota laws in the contemporary era began in Latin America. And so I'm American, right? And all of my students in the US, I now live in London, which is why it's dark out, but all of my students, in the US would have these very stereotypical and sort of negative ideas, right? About how Latin American cultures treated women. And so it would be so rewarding to just sort of break their brains and say, actually, Mexico has gender parity in the Mexican Congress, and the US is decades, if not centuries, away from attaining gender parity in our Congress. So the cultural explanations are complex. And in fact, gender quota laws are decisions that are made by Congresses. They're actually decisions that are made by political elites, right? They're not necessarily made by voters as a whole, although we do find that voters are generally supportive of them. And so with the right set of political variables, especially these arguments about democracy, especially incentives for, say, right-wing parties, they're sort of exhausted of being embarrassed by how retrograde they are. It actually is possible to pass quota laws, even in contexts that we think are culturally perhaps not very friendly. And I just want to say that's also one of the reasons that these laws can feel sort of maybe out of sync with other problems that women face, right? So one of the questions I get a lot is, how could you have gender parity in Mexico when we know that the rates of violence against women and femicide are so high? And excuse me, my answer to that question is, these are really different kinds of processes of cultural change. And one thing we do know from the academic research is that it is much easier to shift attitudes and perceptions about women's political roles, and it can be much more difficult to shift attitudes and perceptions about women's private roles and women's family roles. And so just because, of course, people support women in office and want to vote for a woman president, that really doesn't mean day to day on the ground that individual is, say, treating every woman in his or her life with perfect equality. So cultural change is messy, it's uneven, it's hard, but I think it is possible, even in contexts where we don't expect it, to see some forms of progress.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And then just kind of drawing a light on the messiness of it all, but also pathways through that messiness and how do you cut through it. And, I think I see a few questions that I want to combine here. And I spent some time last year working on some, deliberations around different voting mechanisms, or for, looking at proportional ranked choice voting in Massachusetts, for example. And one of the things that I faced in talking to a lot of grassroots communities across the sort of demographic spectrum was translating the importance of it, but also translating the system itself in a way that is accessible. And like you said, right, there is this feeling that it is designed in sort of the elite corners, but it's not actually is not able. The people are not able to interpret it in their own ways in their own communities, or translated. And I see these questions on the chat as well, and perhaps we can close out with this question on, I saw questions around what are the best ways to apply the lessons from around the world in the US, especially when the systems are so different, and how do we press upon people that we're not there yet, and that ranked choice voting or these different types of electoral options will get us there. So I think my final question to you around your thoughts on how do we communicate the value of these types of electoral options that we have in front of us, and how do we drive advocacy, and how do we translate some of the lessons from around the world into the US context that may feel far and different?
Yeah, I think, sorry, I thought it was on mute. I think those are all really important questions. I mean, especially when single member district systems like you have in the United States, and Canada and the UK at the parliamentary level, right? They're intuitive and they're really easy for voters to understand, right? You have a bunch of candidates and you pick one, right? And so moving to things like proportional representation or ranked choice voting, it is a tough communication barrier because you have to sort of explain a slightly more technically or mathematically complex system to voters. And they have this really intuitive system that already seems, at least, if not fair, at least sort of a straightforward way to make a decision, right? And proportional representation, ranked choice voting, these are not necessarily straightforward ways to make decisions. So advocates have really focused again on the democratic deficits that single member district systems create. So if you think about the case of New Zealand in 1986, which made a shift from having pure single member districts to what we call a mixed system. So they kept some single member districts, but they added proportional representation on top of it. I always ask my students to read portions of that Electoral Commission report from New Zealand in 1986, because the arguments exactly were about the fact that the single member district system was not yielding the most talent, and it was not yielding the most diversity, and they were not electing parliaments that looked like New Zealand. And indeed, once that mixed system was adopted, New Zealand elected not just more women, but more Maori, which is the New Zealand indigenous group, so more Maori representatives, and more representatives from Asian and other sort of non-Anglo backgrounds in New Zealand. So that's a really important aspect of the arguments. The other thing I want to say, if I may, I know we're here to talk about how do we get out of single member districts and how do we get, proportional representation or ranked choice voting in the US. That's great, but it's also a myth that you can't have quotas in single member district systems, because I hear that and it is wrong. The Mexican Congress has 300 single member district seats out of those 500 that the senator mentioned, and the gender parity rule applies to those 300 single member districts, because what it means is that across the total number of districts where parties field candidates, they have to break those districts into half and field, men and women in equal numbers. And it even goes further. It says actually the districts are divided into 3 tiers of winning, competitive, and losing, and parties have to field candidates at gender parity actually within those 3 tiers. So that would be the equivalent of saying, look, if you were going to have gender parity in the US, what might happen? Well, the Republican Party just might run all of I'll use Boston, right? The Republican Party is going to run all their candidates in Boston because that's a Democratic stronghold and they'll never win. But you can design a gender quota in a single member district to both apply and prevent those kinds of shenanigans. So another option, right, is to sort of push back against this narrative that gender quotas would only work in proportional representation, because we have examples across the globe where that is actually not the case.
Thank you so much for that. And, I think that's an important myth to bust in terms of what options we have in front of us, in terms of as advocates and champions of change, and also, most importantly, representation of women in places of power and decision making. Thank you so much, Dr. Piscopo, for this very enriching conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and I can tell from the reactions on the chat and otherwise that this has been such a helpful conversation to really break some of those concepts, understand them, learn from what global examples there are, and how we can adopt them and take them forward in our own contexts. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Alyssa. And thank you to all of the listeners as well for tuning in to this conversation, and also the entire summit. I'm incredibly proud and lucky to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much. Wow, what an amazing way to end out the summit. Thank you so much, Vandinika and Jennifer, for such an engaging conversation. We're sorry that MP Kate Cheney was not able to join us, but it was so wonderful to get such an in-depth conversation with you all. So thank you again. And thank you to all of our incredible experts and speakers from today. It has been such an honor to spend the last 3 days with you all and getting to bring together so many knowledgeable and passionate women from around the world. Each year, our Democracy Solution Summit has continued to show us that despite the ongoing challenges to our democracy and the barriers that women are facing, there are solutions, and these solutions really do work. We have had the opportunity to hear real-life examples of how these solutions are transforming politics and governance for the better. As we wrap things up for this week, we would love to hear from you. Right now, our team will share our attendee survey in the chat, which would only take 5 minutes to complete, and your feedback truly helps us improve the summit and be able to do this year after year. And if you're also interested in getting more involved with Represent Women, please check out our Women's Power Collaborative, which we are also dropping a link in the chat to right now. With that, I want to thank all of our amazing speakers, panelists, and moderators from this week, the incredible Represent Women team who have put so much care and energy into this summit, and of course, to thank you all one last time for joining us this week. We'll leave the webinar open for a few extra minutes to give you all a chance to grab any of those links and other resources shared throughout the day. We sincerely hope that you enjoyed your time here, and we look forward to welcoming you back to events in the future. Have a great rest of your week, and happy International Women's Day.